Rebecca Martinez never imagined her life would become internet famous. She was just a regular woman in her mid-30s, trying to live differently in a world that seemed to demand bigger houses, more stuff, and endless debt. But here she was, standing in her tiny home in Portland, giving yet another tour to a design blogger who couldn't stop gushing about her clever use of space. "And this is where I keep all my dishes," Rebecca said, pulling out a narrow drawer that slid smoothly from beneath her kitchen counter. The blogger snapped photos from every angle, clearly impressed by the magnetic spice rack on the inside of the cabinet door and the fold-down dining table that disappeared completely when not in use. The 320-square-foot home had become something of a local attraction. It sat in a small eco-village on the outskirts of Portland, surrounded by other tiny homes and a few RVs. People who chose to live here did so intentionally. They wanted less space to clean, less stuff to worry about, less impact on the environment, and definitely less money spent on housing. Rebecca's place looked like something out of a magazine. Light wood panels covered the walls, giving everything a warm, natural feeling. A loft bed perched above the living area, accessible by a ladder that doubled as a bookshelf. Windows on both sides let in plenty of natural light, making the small space feel much bigger than it actually was. Plants hung from the ceiling and sat on every available surface, bringing life and color into the compact home. "How do you do it?" the blogger asked, settling onto the small couch that also served as storage. "I mean, don't you feel cramped? Where do you keep everything?" Rebecca smiled. She'd heard these questions 100 times before. "You'd be surprised how little you actually need," she said. "Most people fill their homes with things they never use. I only keep what matters." What Rebecca didn't mention was the hand-woven rug in the center of her floor. It was beautiful, sure, with its intricate patterns in blues and greens, but it also served a very specific purpose. Beneath that rug lay a floor hatch, and beneath that hatch a secret that would soon make headlines across the country. The blogger took a few more photos, thanked Rebecca profusely, and headed out to interview the neighbors. Rebecca watched her go, then locked her door and pulled the curtains closed. She moved the small coffee table aside, rolled back the rug, and revealed the wooden hatch underneath. With practiced ease, she lifted it open. A staircase descended into darkness below. Rebecca flipped a switch and soft LED lights illuminated a set of sturdy wooden steps leading down. She climbed down and closed the hatch behind her, the world above disappearing as she entered her real home. The underground space opened up around her like magic. 2,000 square feet of carefully designed living area stretched out in all directions. A proper living room with a sectional couch faced a large television mounted on the wall. To the left, a full kitchen with granite countertops, a regular-sized refrigerator, and even a dishwasher. Beyond that, she could see her bedroom, her office, and the door to her art studio. This was where Rebecca actually lived. The tiny home above was just for show, though she did sleep up there sometimes when she had guests staying over at the eco-village. Down here, she had everything she'd given up when she'd supposedly embraced the minimalist lifestyle. Her book collection lined an entire wall of the library nook. Her art supplies filled cabinets in the studio. Her clothes hung in a proper walk-in closet. Rebecca had built all of this herself. Well, mostly by herself. She'd hired contractors for some of the specialized work, but she'd told them she was building a storm shelter, which wasn't entirely a lie. The structure could definitely withstand a storm. It could withstand pretty much anything. She walked over to her kitchen and started making dinner, something that would have been nearly impossible in the cramped kitchenette above. As water boiled on the stove, she thought about how she'd ended up here, living this strange double life. 3 years ago, Rebecca had been laid off from her job as a civil engineer. The pandemic had hit the construction industry hard, and her company had to make cuts. She'd walked away with a decent severance package and a lot of uncertainty about the future. Instead of immediately looking for another job, she'd decided to do something radical. She'd bought this piece of land in the eco-village. It wasn't expensive, relatively speaking. The community was new and trying to attract residents who shared their values. Rebecca had told them she wanted to build a tiny home and live sustainably. They'd loved the idea and welcomed her with open arms. What she hadn't told them was her real plan. While she applied for permits to build her tiny home above ground, she'd quietly begun excavating below. She did most of the work herself, digging late at night and in the early morning hours when her neighbors were asleep or away. It had taken months of backbreaking labor, but she'd managed to create a space large enough for her underground home. The engineering challenges had been significant. Waterproofing was crucial. She'd used multiple layers of protection to ensure water would never seep in. Climate control was another issue. Underground spaces can be damp and cold, but Rebecca had installed a geothermal heating and cooling system that kept the temperature perfectly comfortable year-round. Natural light had been her biggest concern. Nobody wants to live like a mole, so she'd designed a series of light wells, vertical shafts that brought sunlight down from above. To anyone walking around outside, they looked like decorative garden features, metal sculptures with glass panels, but they served a vital purpose, filling her underground home with natural daylight. She'd even created a ventilation system that was nearly invisible from above. Air flowed in and out through hollow garden sculptures and what appeared to be drainage pipes. The system was so effective that the air down here felt fresher than in many above-ground homes. The solar panels that powered everything were disguised as part of the tiny home's roof and scattered among the garden decorations. A rainwater collection system provided water, filtered and purified to drinking quality. She was completely self-sufficient down here. Rebecca drained her pasta and sat down at her dining table, a real table with 4 chairs, not a fold-down surface for one. She ate slowly, enjoying the space around her. This was the life she'd wanted, the freedom to live comfortably without spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on a traditional house. The satisfaction of building something with her own hands, the privacy to live life on her own terms. But as she washed her dishes in her full-sized sink, she felt a small twinge of guilt. She'd built a reputation as a minimalist, as someone who'd given up material possessions for a simpler life. People looked up to her. They shared her story online. They asked for her advice, and all of it was built on a lie. Not a malicious lie, but a lie nonetheless. Rebecca pushed the thought aside. Nobody was getting hurt. She wasn't breaking any laws, at least not any she knew of. The tiny home above ground had proper permits. The space below was technically on her own property. She paid her taxes. She wasn't bothering anyone. What could possibly go wrong? She had no idea that in just a few weeks a spring storm would begin a chain of events that would expose her secret to the world. She couldn't have known that her carefully constructed double life was about to come crashing down, or that millions of people would soon be debating whether she was a genius or a fraud. For now, she finished her dinner, cleaned up her kitchen, and settled onto her comfortable couch to watch television in her spacious underground living room. Above her head, the tiny home sat empty and perfect, waiting to fool the next visitor who came calling. The idea had come to Rebecca on a Tuesday afternoon in May, 3 years earlier. She'd been sitting in her apartment, staring at a severance check and wondering what to do with her life. The pandemic had turned everything upside down. Her engineering job was gone. Her savings were decent, but not enough to buy a house in Portland's crazy real estate market. And honestly, she wasn't sure she wanted to go back to the corporate world anyway. She'd spent the previous months working from home, crammed into a 1-bedroom apartment that cost way too much money. Every day felt the same. Wake up, work, sleep, repeat. The walls seemed to close in on her a little more each week. When the layoff came, it felt less like a disaster and more like an opportunity. That's when she started researching alternative housing. Tiny homes were everywhere online. People downsizing, simplifying, embracing minimalism. The houses were cute, sure, but Rebecca kept thinking about the reality of living in 300 square feet. Where would she put her books? Her art supplies? What about having friends over for dinner? Then late one night, scrolling through articles about underground homes, something clicked in her mind. What if she could have both? A tiny home that satisfied zoning requirements and community expectations, but with a real home hidden below where nobody could see it. The more she thought about it, the more sense it made. Underground homes were incredibly energy efficient. The earth provided natural insulation, keeping temperatures stable year-round. They were quiet, private, and protected from storms. And in a place like the eco-village where people respected each other's space, nobody would be poking around her property asking questions. Rebecca had spent 2 weeks drawing up plans. Her engineering background came in handy. She calculated load-bearing requirements, drainage patterns, and structural integrity. She figured out how to ventilate the space, how to bring in natural light, and how to make everything look innocent from above ground. The hard part was finding the right property. She needed land where she could dig without hitting bedrock or underground water sources. The eco-village had been perfect. The community was new and eager for residents. The soil composition was ideal, and the lots were just far enough apart that she could work without constant observation. She'd bought the land in August and immediately applied for permits to build her tiny home. The approval process took weeks, but eventually everything was approved. That's when the real work began. Rebecca started excavating in October. She'd rented a small excavator, telling the rental company she was building a root cellar and preparing the foundation for her tiny home. Both were technically true. She worked mainly at night, using the excavator's lights to see what she was doing. The machine was loud, but construction noise was common in the growing community. Nobody complained. The digging took 6 weeks. 6 weeks of operating heavy machinery in the cold and dark, hauling dirt away in a rented truck, and making sure the walls of her excavation were properly shored up. Her hands developed calluses. Her back ached constantly, but she kept going, driven by a vision of the space she was creating. Once the hole was deep enough and wide enough, the really technical work began. She hired contractors for some of it, but she was careful about what she told them. She brought in one crew to pour the concrete foundation and walls, telling them it was a large storm shelter with multiple rooms. Another crew installed the waterproofing system. A third handled the electrical work. She never hired the same company twice if she could help it, and she never let any of them see the full scope of the project. The electrician didn't know about the elaborate ventilation system. The plumber didn't know about the light wells. Everyone thought they were working on a piece of a storm shelter, not a complete underground home. Rebecca did most of the interior work herself. She installed the drywall, painted the walls, and laid the flooring. She built custom cabinets for her kitchen and bookshelves for her library. Every weekend was spent underground, working by the light of construction lamps, bringing her vision to life. The light wells had been her proudest achievement. She designed them herself, cylindrical shafts that extended from her underground ceiling to the surface above. Each one was lined with reflective material to bounce sunlight down into the space below. At ground level, she'd covered them with decorative metal sculptures that looked like art installations. Glass panels within the sculptures let light through while keeping out rain and debris. Walking through her underground home on a sunny day felt magical. Natural light streamed in from multiple directions, creating a warm, bright atmosphere that didn't feel underground at all. She'd positioned the light wells strategically, ensuring that her living room, kitchen, and art studio all received plenty of sunlight. The ventilation system had been equally challenging. She couldn't just stick pipes up through the ground. That would look suspicious. Instead, she'd created a network of air channels that connected to what appeared to be ordinary garden features. A decorative fountain actually housed an air intake. Several garden sculptures contained exhaust vents. A fake drainage system near her tiny home pulled fresh air down below. The system worked beautifully. Air circulated constantly, filtered and temperature-controlled by the geothermal system she'd installed. The underground space never felt stuffy or damp. In fact, it felt fresher than most above-ground homes. By March, 7 months after she'd started, the underground home was complete. Rebecca had spent nearly her entire severance package plus a chunk of her savings. But standing in her finished living room, looking around at the space she'd created, she knew it was worth every penny. She'd furnished the place slowly over the following months. A comfortable couch from a furniture store, a real bed, not a loft mattress, kitchen appliances that actually worked properly, bookshelves filled with the collection she'd been storing at her parents' house, art supplies, craft materials, and all the things she'd thought she'd have to give up to live affordably. The tiny home above ground went up quickly after that. She hired a company specializing in tiny homes, and they had it built and installed within a month. It was cute and functional, exactly what people expected. She decorated it carefully, creating the perfect minimalist aesthetic. Just enough personal touches to seem lived in, but sparse enough to maintain the illusion of simplified living. The floor hatch connecting both spaces had been her final touch. She'd built it herself, ensuring it was perfectly disguised when covered by the rug. The latch was smooth and silent. The stairs were sturdy and safe. Moving between her two worlds became second nature. Living the double life turned out to be easier than Rebecca had expected. She kept her toiletries in both places, along with a few changes of clothes. She made sure to cook in the tiny home occasionally, so it would smell lived in when visitors came by. She genuinely did sleep in the loft bed sometimes, especially when she wanted to wake up to the sunrise through the tiny home's large windows. But most of her real life happened below ground. That's where she worked on her freelance engineering projects, having slowly built up a client base. That's where she painted and drew, spreading art supplies across her studio without worrying about space. That's where she cooked elaborate meals, read books until 2 in the morning, and lived like a normal person. The eco-village community embraced her. They loved having a real minimalist among them. Rebecca gave tours of her tiny home, sharing tips on storage and organization. She attended community meetings and potluck dinners. She made friends with her neighbors, though she was always careful not to get too close. Close friends might want to visit more often, might notice inconsistencies in her story. One neighbor, David Chen, lived 3 lots over in a converted school bus. He was friendly but not intrusive, which Rebecca appreciated. They'd chat occasionally about sustainable living and share vegetables from their gardens. He never asked uncomfortable questions. Another neighbor, Patricia Okonkwo, lived with her teenage daughter in a slightly larger tiny home. Patricia was a freelance writer who worked from home. She often praised Rebecca's commitment to minimalism, saying she wished she could pare down her possessions as much as Rebecca had. If only they knew. If only any of them knew that the woman they admired for living with so little actually had more space than most of them combined. Rebecca sometimes felt guilty about the deception, but she pushed those feelings aside. She wasn't hurting anyone. She was just living her life in a way that made sense to her. The secret became easier to keep as time went on. The story became routine. Rebecca almost believed it herself sometimes. She was the tiny homegirl, the minimalist, the woman who'd given up material possessions for a simpler life. And then came the storm. The storm hit Portland on a Wednesday evening in late March. Rebecca had seen the weather warnings all week, but Pacific Northwest storms were common this time of year. She'd weathered plenty of them in her underground home without any issues. The earth-sheltered design was supposed to be stormproof. That's what all her research had promised. The rain started around 6 in the evening, light at first, then growing heavier as darkness fell. Rebecca was downstairs in her living room, working on a design project for a client. Thunder rumbled overhead, muffled by the earth surrounding her. She liked storms from down here. They felt distant and harmless, like watching bad weather through a television screen. By 9 o'clock, the rain was pounding so hard she could hear it even through all that earth and concrete. The sound of water rushing across the ground above created a weird whooshing noise that echoed down through her light wells. Rebecca saved her work and decided to call it a night. She climbed the stairs to her tiny home, planning to sleep in the loft bed. During heavy storms, she always stayed above ground just in case something went wrong with the drainage systems below. She made tea in the tiny kitchenette and settled into the loft with a book. Rain hammered against the windows. Wind shook the little structure just enough to remind her how small it was. Outside, she could hear the storm tearing through the eco-village. Someone's wind chimes were going crazy. A loose piece of metal was banging against something repeatedly. Rebecca woke up around 2 in the morning to an even louder sound. The rain hadn't let up at all. If anything, it was worse. She lay in bed listening, hoping the storm would pass soon. Eventually, she drifted back to sleep. Morning came gray and wet. The rain had finally stopped, but everything outside was soaked. Puddles covered the ground. Small streams of water ran between the houses, finding their way to lower ground. Rebecca made coffee and looked out at the damage. A few tree branches had come down. Someone's solar panels had been torn loose. Nothing too serious, but enough to keep everyone busy with cleanup. She was finishing her second cup of coffee when someone knocked on her door. Rebecca opened it to find David Chen standing outside in a rain jacket, looking concerned. "Hey, Rebecca, you okay? Your property looks a little rough out here." "Yeah, I'm fine. Why, what's wrong?" David gestured toward the far edge of her lot. "There's a sinkhole or something over there. Happened during the storm, I think. I was walking around checking on everyone and noticed it. Thought you should know." Rebecca's stomach dropped, but she kept her face neutral. "A sinkhole? How big?" "Not huge, but big enough. Maybe 3 feet across?" "I didn't get too close. You should probably take a look and see if you need to report it to the community board. Thanks for letting me know. I'll check it out." David nodded and headed off to continue his rounds. Rebecca closed the door and stood there for a moment, her heart racing. A sinkhole on her property. This was bad. This was very bad. She threw on boots and a jacket and walked quickly to the edge of her lot. The sinkhole was right where David had said it would be, near the property line. The ground had collapsed inward, creating a depression about 3 feet wide and maybe 2 feet deep. But that wasn't the worst part. At the bottom of the depression, partially visible through mud and water, was concrete. A concrete wall with what looked like the edge of a window. Rebecca felt like she might throw up. She looked around quickly. No one else was nearby. David had already moved on to check other properties. She had a few minutes to think. The storm had saturated the ground, and the weight of all that water had caused the earth above her underground home to collapse slightly. The soil she'd carefully mounded over the structure had given way, exposing part of the exterior wall. Anyone who looked closely would see that this wasn't an old foundation or forgotten bunker. The concrete was too new, the window was modern, and if they looked through that window, they'd see furniture, lights, and clear evidence of a living space. Rebecca's mind raced through her options. She could try to fill in the hole herself, but that would look suspicious. The community board would wonder why she hadn't reported it, and David had already seen it, which meant other people would hear about it soon. News traveled fast in a small community. She could claim she didn't know it was there, that it must be from previous owners. But she'd bought raw land. There weren't supposed to be any structures on it at all, and besides, everything looked too new. For an hour, Rebecca stood there in the drizzle, staring at the exposed section of her secret, trying to figure out what to do. She finally went back inside her tiny home and sat on the couch, feeling the walls of her carefully constructed life starting to crumble. By afternoon, more neighbors had walked by to survey storm damage. Patricia stopped by with her daughter to check if Rebecca needed any help. They chatted for a few minutes before Patricia said, "David mentioned something about a sinkhole on your property?" "Yeah, near the back corner. Just some erosion from the storm, I think. You should probably have someone look at it. My daughter's friend's mom is on the community board. I can let her know if you want." "That's okay," Rebecca said quickly. "I'll handle it." "Thanks, though." But she knew it was only a matter of time. In a community this small, people talked. They helped each other. They got involved. That's what made the eco-village special, but right now it was the last thing Rebecca wanted. The next morning, someone from the local news knocked on her door. Not the tiny home door. The main door that the community thought was her only door. Rebecca answered it to find a young reporter standing there with a camera operator beside her. "Hi, I'm Kennedy Wallace from KPTV. We're doing a story on storm damage in the area, and someone mentioned there was an interesting situation on your property. Mind if we take a look?" Rebecca's throat went dry. "Who told you about my property?" "Just a tip from someone in the community. They said there was a sinkhole that revealed some kind of underground structure. Is that true?" There it was. The moment Rebecca had been dreading. She could send them away, but that would just make them more curious. Local news loved mysterious stories. If she refused to talk, they'd dig deeper and the story would get bigger. She made a split-second decision. If this was going to come out anyway, she might as well control the narrative. "Okay," Rebecca said slowly. "Yeah, there's an underground structure. But it's not what you think." Kennedy's eyes lit up. "Can we see it?" Rebecca hesitated, then nodded. She'd kept this secret for 3 years. She'd built something amazing, something that solved real problems about housing and affordability and living space. Maybe it was time people knew. Maybe they'd understand. Or maybe they'd crucify her for it. She led Kennedy and the camera operator around to the sinkhole first. They filmed it from multiple angles, the concrete wall clearly visible in the daylight. Then Rebecca took a deep breath and said something she'd never said to anyone outside her family. "That's the exterior wall of my actual home. The tiny home everyone sees is just the entrance." Kennedy stared at her. "Wait, what? You have a whole house underground?" "Yes, about 2,000 square feet. I built it myself over 3 years ago. Can we see inside?" Rebecca looked at the camera, then back at Kennedy. This was it. The point of no return. Once she showed them, everyone would know. Her quiet life would be over. But the alternative was worse. If she refused now, they'd make her look like she was hiding something terrible. At least if she showed them, she could explain why she'd done it. "Follow me," she said. They walked back to the tiny home. Rebecca unlocked the door and let them inside. Kennedy and the camera operator looked around at the carefully curated minimalist space, not understanding yet. Then Rebecca moved the coffee table, rolled back the rug, and revealed the floor hatch. Kennedy gasped. "Oh my God, there's a whole staircase." Rebecca opened the hatch. Lights flickered on automatically below, illuminating the wooden steps. "Welcome to where I actually live." She descended first, and Kennedy and the camera operator followed, their equipment bumping against the narrow stairwell. When they emerged into the underground living room, Kennedy's jaw literally dropped open. "This is incredible. This is a full house. You have a regular kitchen. A huge TV. Is that a hallway? How many rooms are down here?" Rebecca gave them the tour, pointing out the bedroom, the office, the art studio, the library nook. She explained the light wells, the ventilation system, the geothermal heating and cooling. She showed them how natural light filled the space, how comfortable and normal it felt. Kennedy was furious with excitement, asking questions rapid fire while the camera captured everything. "How long did this take to build? Did you have permits? Does anyone else know about this? How much did it cost? Why did you do it?" Rebecca answered as honestly as she could. She talked about being laid off, about the insane cost of housing, about wanting to live comfortably without going into massive debt. She explained her engineering background and how she designed everything to be safe and sustainable. "But why keep it secret?" Kennedy asked. "Why pretend to live in just the tiny home?" Rebecca sat down on her couch, suddenly exhausted. "Because people have ideas about how you're supposed to live. The tiny home community respected me for living small. Society respects minimalism. But the truth is, I didn't want to give up space. I just wanted to afford it. So I found a way to have both." Kennedy looked around the underground home one more time. "You know this is going to blow up online, right?" "This is an amazing story," Rebecca nodded. She knew. Her secret was out now. There was no taking it back. The question was, what would happen next? The news story went live that evening. Kennedy had worked fast, editing the footage and getting it posted to the station's website within hours. The headline read, "The Tiny Home That Wasn't, Local Woman's Underground Home Shocks Community." Rebecca sat in her underground living room, laptop open, watching the view counter climb. 100 views. 500. 1,000. Within 2 hours, it had been shared on social media platforms dozens of times. By morning, it had 500,000 views. Her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Text messages from friends she hadn't talked to in years. Emails from strangers. Missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize. Rebecca turned off her phone and tried to process what was happening. The comment section below the news article was chaos. Some people thought she was a genius. Others called her a liar and a fraud. Everyone had an opinion. "This is brilliant. She solved the housing crisis for herself. So she's been lying to everyone this whole time? That's messed up. I wish I had thought of this. Imagine the property taxes she's saving. This has to be illegal. There's no way she has permits for that. She's an engineer who built her own underground home. That's incredible. What else is she lying about?" Rebecca read through hundreds of comments, her stomach churning. People she'd never met were dissecting her choices, her character, her entire life. Some defended her. Many didn't. The internet had opinions, and they were loud. By the second day, the story had been picked up by national news outlets. Major websites were running articles about her. Morning shows were calling, asking if she'd come on for interviews. A few architectural magazines wanted to feature her home. But there were also legal websites analyzing whether she'd broken any laws. The eco-village community was divided. Rebecca saw it firsthand when she went to the community meeting that weekend. She almost didn't go, but hiding felt worse than facing everyone. She walked into the common building and felt every eye turned toward her. The room went quiet for a moment before conversation slowly resumed. Patricia gave her a small wave from across the room. David avoided looking at her entirely. The community board president, Lynn Rodriguez, called the meeting to order. She was a woman in her 60s who'd been living in a converted shipping container for 5 years. She'd always been fair and level-headed, but today her expression was hard to read. "I think we all know why there's extra tension in the room today," Lynn began. "Rebecca's situation has brought a lot of attention to our community. Some of it positive, some of it not. I want to give everyone a chance to speak, but let's keep things respectful." One by one, people stood up to share their thoughts. Some were supportive. Others felt betrayed. A man named Russell, who lived in a school bus with his wife, stood up. "Look, I get why people are upset, but Rebecca didn't hurt anyone. She found a creative solution to an expensive problem. Isn't that what we're all trying to do here? A woman named Diane, who'd interviewed Rebecca for her blog about minimalist living, stood next. I feel stupid. I wrote this whole article about her lifestyle, and it was all fake. She made fools of all of us, Patricia spoke up. She didn't force anyone to write about her. People chose to feature her tiny home because it was impressive. The tiny home is real. She just has more space than we thought. David finally looked at Rebecca. The thing that bothers me is the deception. We're supposed to be a community built on trust and transparency. How can we trust her now? Rebecca had been sitting quietly, but she couldn't stay silent anymore. She stood up, her legs shaky. Can I say something? Lynn nodded. Of course. I know a lot of you feel like I lied. And you're right, I did. I wasn't honest about where I actually live and how much space I have. But I want you to understand why. Rebecca took a breath, choosing her words carefully. When I moved here, I was broke and unemployed. I had this severance package and no idea what to do with my life. I couldn't afford a regular house, not even close, but I also couldn't live in 300 square feet. I'm not that person, and I didn't want to pretend to be. She looked around the room. So I found a way to have what I needed without going into debt. I used my skills as an engineer to build something affordable and sustainable. Yes, I kept it secret because I knew people would judge me for it. And I was right. Look at what's happening now. But you let people write articles about you, Diane said. You gave tours. You acted like you were something you weren't. I gave tours of my tiny home, which is real. I never claimed to live some perfect minimalist life. People assumed that, and I didn't correct them. That's on me, but everything I showed people was true. The tiny home exists. I do live there sometimes. I just also live somewhere else. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Russell spoke again. Has anyone actually asked if what she built is safe? Because from what I saw in the news, it looks pretty well engineered. That's what concerns me, Lynn said, looking at Rebecca. The legal aspects. Did you have permits for the underground structure? Rebecca shook her head. I have permits for the tiny home. The underground part exists in a kind of gray area. I own the land. The structure meets building codes. But I never applied for specific permits for it because I knew they'd be denied, or would require expensive inspections and modifications. So the city doesn't know about it. They do now. I got a call from the building department yesterday. They're sending inspectors next week. Lynn sighed. That's what I was afraid of. Rebecca, I appreciate your honesty today. But you've put the whole community in a difficult position. We have regulations for a reason. If the city decides to crack down because of this, it could affect all of us. The meeting continued for another hour, but the main points had been made. Some people supported Rebecca. Others wanted her gone. Most were somewhere in between, unsure what to think. When Rebecca finally left the meeting, she felt exhausted, but also slightly relieved. At least everything was out in the open now. No more secrets. No more pretending. The next week was a whirlwind. The building inspectors came and spent an entire day examining her underground home. They checked the electrical work, the plumbing, the structural integrity, the ventilation, everything. Rebecca followed them around, answering questions and providing documentation of the work she'd done. The lead inspector, a guy named Frank who'd been doing this for 30 years, seemed almost impressed despite himself. I've never seen anything quite like this, he admitted. It's actually built really well. Better than some above-ground homes I've inspected. So is it legal? Rebecca asked. Frank scratched his head. That's the million-dollar question. Technically, you should have had permits. But there's no specific code that says you can't build an underground home on your own property. And everything here meets safety standards. I need to talk to the city attorney about how to proceed. Meanwhile, the online attention continued to grow. Rebecca's story had sparked a national conversation about housing, building codes, and alternative living. Architects started reaching out, wanting to know more about her design. Engineers asked technical questions about the construction. Housing advocates pointed to her story as an example of why building regulations needed reform. There were also offers. A streaming service wanted to make a documentary about her. A publisher wanted her to write a book. Several home-building companies wanted to hire her as a consultant. It was overwhelming. Rebecca did a few interviews trying to explain her perspective. She went on a podcast about sustainable living. She talked to a journalist from an architecture magazine. Each time she emphasized the same points. Housing was too expensive, building codes were too restrictive, and people needed more options. But she also acknowledged her mistakes. "I should have been honest from the beginning," she said during one interview. "I let people believe something that wasn't entirely true, and that was wrong. But I don't regret building my home. I just wish I'd been braver about owning what I'd done." 3 weeks after the news broke, Rebecca got a call from the city attorney's office. Her hands shook as she answered. "Ms. Martinez, this is Calvin Brooks from the city attorney's office. I've been reviewing your case with the building department. We need to discuss how to resolve this situation." "Okay," Rebecca said, bracing herself for bad news. "Here's what we're proposing. You'll need to apply for retroactive permits for the underground structure. There will be fees involved, and you'll need to pass all required inspections. But given that the structure meets our safety codes and doesn't pose any risk to public health or safety, we're willing to work with you on this." Rebecca felt tears spring to her eyes. "Really, I can keep it?" "If you complete the permitting process and pay the associated fees, yes. This is an unusual situation, and we don't want to set a precedent for people building without permits. But we also recognize that you've created something innovative and safe. We'd rather regulate it than tear it down." When she hung up, Rebecca sat on her underground couch and cried. Relief, exhaustion, gratitude all mixed together. Her secret was out. Her life had been turned upside down. But she got to keep her home. That was all that really mattered. 6 months after her story went viral, Rebecca sat in a coffee shop across from a young couple who'd driven 3 hours to meet her. They had questions about building their own underground home, and Rebecca had agreed to talk with them over coffee. "The most important thing," Rebecca explained, "is to do it legally from the start. Learn from my mistakes. Talk to the city before you dig the first shovelful of dirt. Yes, it takes longer. Yes, there's more paperwork. But it's worth it to avoid what I went through." The woman, Angela, took notes on her phone. Her husband, Troy, leaned forward eagerly. "But the city actually let you keep it, right? So it is possible." "It's possible, but every city is different. Portland ended up being surprisingly open-minded once they saw what I'd built. Other places might not be. You need to research your local codes and find out what's actually allowed." This had become Rebecca's life now, consulting with people who wanted to build alternative homes, answering emails from architects and engineers, speaking at conferences about sustainable housing. She'd even testified before the city council about updating building codes to allow for more creative housing solutions. The fees for her retroactive permits had been expensive, almost $20,000, but it was better than losing everything. The inspections had taken weeks, with various departments coming through to verify that everything met code. In the end, they'd found only minor issues that needed fixing. A handrail that needed to be added to her stairs, some additional fire safety equipment, an upgraded emergency exit. Rebecca had made all the changes and passed her final inspection in July. She'd actually cried when the inspector signed off on the paperwork. Her underground home was officially legal. She could breathe again. The eco-village community had eventually come around, though it took time. Some residents never really forgave her for the deception. David still kept his distance, but others, like Patricia and Russell, had become even closer friends. They appreciated her honesty once everything came out, and they respected how she'd handled the aftermath. The community had benefited from the attention in unexpected ways. Several news articles about Rebecca's home had mentioned the eco-village, and that publicity brought new residents. People who were interested in alternative living, but hadn't known places like this existed. The village was growing, and with it came more acceptance of different approaches to housing. Rebecca had turned down the reality show offers and the book deals that wanted to sensationalize her story. But she'd said yes to a documentary filmmaker named Iris Chan, who approached her with a different angle. Iris wanted to make a film about the housing crisis and how people were finding creative solutions. Rebecca's story was just one part of a bigger picture. The documentary had followed Rebecca for 3 months, filming her daily life, her consulting work, and her advocacy for housing reform. It also featured other people living in converted buses, tiny homes, co-housing communities, and other alternative setups. The film, called Building Different, had premiered at a film festival in September and was now streaming online. Rebecca watched herself on screen sometimes and barely recognized the person she'd been a year ago. The woman who'd been so afraid of judgment that she'd hidden her entire life underground. She was different now. More confident. More willing to be seen. The online attention had mostly died down, though her story still popped up occasionally in articles about housing innovation. She'd learned to ignore the negative comments and focus on the people her story actually helped. Every week she got emails from people saying she'd inspired them to think differently about housing, about building codes, about what was possible. One email had come from a single mother in Seattle who'd been living in her car with her 2 kids. Rebecca's story had led her to research alternative housing, and she'd eventually found a tiny home community that had space for her family. "You showed me that there are options I never knew existed," the woman wrote. "Thank you for being brave enough to share your story. Those emails made everything worth it. The scrutiny, the judgment, the stress of nearly losing her home. If her experience helped other people find solutions to their housing problems, then the whole mess had meaning." Rebecca had also started a nonprofit organization called Underground Solutions. The name was a play on her story, but the mission was serious, helping people navigate alternative housing options and advocating for building code reform. She'd assembled a small team of volunteers, including architects, lawyers, and housing advocates. Together, they provided free consultations to people exploring unconventional living situations. The organization had helped dozens of people in just a few months. They'd assisted a retired teacher in getting permits for a shipping container home. They'd connected a young family with resources for building a straw bale house. They'd provided legal guidance to a group trying to start a co-housing community. Rebecca also worked directly with city officials now, serving on a task force examining Portland's building codes. The group met monthly to discuss how regulations could be updated to allow for more housing innovation while still maintaining safety standards. It was slow work, but progress was happening. "The thing people don't understand," Rebecca told the task force during one meeting, "is that most people who pursue alternative housing aren't trying to cut corners or avoid regulations. They're just trying to afford a decent place to live. If we make the legal path easier and more affordable, fewer people will build in secret like I did." The task force was considering several proposals, including creating a new category for earth-sheltered homes like Rebecca's, streamlining the permitting process for tiny homes and reducing fees for low-income builders. Nothing had been approved yet, but conversations were happening that wouldn't have occurred without Rebecca's story bringing attention to the issue. Her consulting business had grown beyond what she'd imagined. She now worked with clients all over the country, helping them design underground homes, earth-sheltered structures, and other alternative housing. Some were wealthy people looking for unique vacation homes. Others were middle-class families trying to build affordably. Rebecca charged sliding-scale fees based on what people could pay. She'd also started teaching. A local community college had asked her to develop a course on alternative residential design. Twice a month, she stood in front of a classroom of students, sharing everything she'd learned about building underground, working with difficult terrain, and creating sustainable systems. The students were fascinated, asking endless questions about her own home and the technical challenges she'd overcome. The tiny home above ground still served its purpose. Rebecca slept there sometimes, especially on beautiful mornings when she wanted to wake up with sunlight streaming through the windows. She still gave tours occasionally, though now she showed people both levels. The tiny home was no longer a deception, but rather an interesting design choice, a charming entrance to the larger home below. Her neighbors had gotten used to the occasional visitors who came to see her place. Some found it annoying, but others appreciated the attention it brought to alternative living. The eco-village had become a minor tourist destination, with people stopping by to see where the woman with the underground house lived. Rebecca had made peace with her decision to build in secret. Even though she wished she'd handled things differently, she understood now that fear had driven her choices. Fear of judgment, fear of rejection, fear of being told no. That fear had led her to hide something she should have been proud of from the beginning. "If I could go back and do it again," she told a podcaster during an interview, "I'd build it the same way architecturally, but I'd be honest about what I was doing. I'd fight for the permits from the start. I'd advocate for myself instead of hiding. The deception cost me more in stress and relationships than it saved me in convenience." 1 year after her story broke, Rebecca received an award from a sustainable building organization. They recognized her contributions to innovative housing design and her advocacy work. Standing on stage accepting the award, Looking out at an audience of architects, engineers, and housing advocates, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. Not in the hiding, but in the building. Not in the deception, but in the innovation. Not in keeping secrets, but in eventually telling the truth. After the ceremony, a young woman approached her. She looked nervous, clutching a folder of papers. "Ms. Martinez? I'm studying architecture, and I've designed an underground home for my thesis project. Would you mind looking at it? Your story inspired me to think about housing differently." Rebecca smiled and took the folder. "I'd be happy to look at it. But can I give you one piece of advice first? Of course, and whatever you build it in the light. Don't hide your ideas because you're afraid of what people will think. The world needs more people willing to challenge how we think about housing. Be one of those people. Be brave enough to do it openly." The young woman nodded, her eyes bright with determination. Rebecca walked out of the building that evening, feeling lighter than she had in years. Her secret was no longer a secret. Her shame had transformed into purpose. Her underground home had become a platform for change. She drove back to the eco-village, parked her car, and walked across her property to the tiny home that everyone could see. She unlocked the door, rolled back the familiar rug, and descended the stairs into the home she'd built with her own hands. The home that had caused so much trouble and opened so many doors. The lights came on automatically, warm and welcoming. Rebecca looked around at the space she'd created, the space she'd almost lost, the space that had changed everything. And she smiled. This was home. All of it, the tiny house and the underground palace, the public face and the private space, the mistake and the innovation, the secret and the story. All of it was home, and now the whole world knew.